His own brothers didn't believe him. Not strangers, not the religious establishment in Jerusalem, who had already tried once to kill him. His own brothers, the sons of Mary, the boys he grew up alongside in Nazareth, who had watched him at the dinner table and in the carpenter's shop for 30 years. They stand in front of him at the start of this chapter and essentially dare him to prove himself publicly, with more than a hint of mockery in their words. And Jesus' response to that challenge is not what you'd expect. He doesn't take the bait. He tells them he isn't going to the feast. And then he goes anyway, quietly, secretly, on his own timing rather than theirs. Welcome back to Unlock the Word. I am Matthew Harvey, and I am so happy you are joining us as we are unpacking this book, the Bible, specifically the Gospel of John. Today, we're going to be in chapter 7, focusing on the first 24 verses, which is the story of Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles, teaching in the temple with an authority that stuns even the people trying to discredit him in front of a crowd that can't decide whether he's a good man or a deceiver, whether to celebrate him or to arrest him. So, this is one of the most tension filled settings that we're going to go over, and we're going to walk through it today slowly. So, here we go. Let's get into a little bit of a recap of where we left off in chapter 6, right? In our last episode, we closed out chapter 6 with a crowd's mass departure after what we've called the bread of life discourse. And we saw Peter's confession, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We also learned that there's someone standing in this group of believers who would at some point betray Jesus. And John calls out who that person is. It's Judas. Before that, across episodes 8 through 13, we've traced healing from across a 20-mile barrier based on a single spoken word. We've seen healing that had been waited on for over 38 years as a man was sitting at the pool of Bethesda. And we also saw Jesus' full legal defense of his equality with the Father. And finally, the feeding of 5,000 and the bread of life discourse that split up that crowd. Now, John is moving us forward in the story roughly about 6 months from spring near Passover to early autumn, and one of the most significant festivals in the entire Jewish calendar, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. Understanding this feast is essential to understanding everything Jesus says and does across this chapter and the next one. So let's set the stage carefully before we get into it too much. By starting with the Word of God. So let's jump into chapter 7. After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now, the feast of the Jews, the Feast of Booths, was near. So his brothers said to him, Move on from here and go into Judea, so that your disciples also may see your works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself is striving to be known publicly. If you are doing these things, show yourself to the world. For not even his brothers believed in him. So Jesus said to them, My time is not here yet, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it, that its deeds are evil. Go up to the feast yourselves. I am not going up to the feast because my time has not yet fully arrived. Now, having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as though in secret. So the Jews were looking at him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was a great deal of talk about him in secret among the crowds. Some were saying, "He is a good man." Others were saying, "No, on the contrary, he's misleading people." However, no one was speaking openly about him for fear of the Jews. But when it was now the middle of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple area and began to teach. The Jews then were astonished, saying, "How has this man become learned, not having been educated?" So Jesus answered them and said, "My teaching is not my own, but his who sent me. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know about the teaching, whether it is of God, or I am speaking for myself. The one who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Did Moses not give you the law? And yet none of you carries out the law. Why are you seeking to kill me?" The crowd answered, "You have a demon who is seeking to kill you." Jesus answered them, "I did one deed, and you are all astonished. For this reason, Moses has given you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And even on the Sabbath, you circumcise a man. If a man receives circumcision on a Sabbath, so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry at me because I made an entire man well on a Sabbath? Do not judge by the outward appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." All right, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start with verses 1 and 2. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Feast of Booths was at hand. John is opening this up and reminding us plainly in the opening line of the events of chapter 5 and Jesus' healing at Bethsaida and the resulting attempt to kill him. He's letting us know that these are very much active things that are still happening in the background. And so Jesus is deliberately staying in Galilee away from Jerusalem because there's a real danger there if he goes. And then he lets us know that the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, is at hand. Now, what is the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles? This is one of the three great pilgrimage festivals in the Jewish calendar alongside Passover and Pentecost, when Jewish families were expected to travel to Jerusalem. The feast actually commemorated Israel's 40 years of wilderness wandering after the Exodus, when people lived in temporary shelters or booths constructed of branches and leaves. And so families would build and live in these booths for 8 days of the festival, even in Jerusalem itself, as a physical, embodied remembrance of dependence on God's provision during those wilderness years. The feast also included two dramatic ceremonial events and elements that are going to matter enormously for understanding the rest of this chapter and the next. There's a daily water drawing ceremony where priests processed from the pool of Siloam back to the temple with water poured out at the altar, and a nightly lighting ceremony where massive golden lampstands in the court of women illuminated the entire city, commemorating the pillar of fire that led Israel through the wilderness by night. Now, I want you to keep both of those ceremonies in mind, the water and the light, because Jesus is going to directly and deliberately invoke both of them at the right dramatic moments across this chapter and the next. So, first off, we see in the first couple verses that Jesus is still in danger because the Jews are trying to kill him. They're trying to kill him based on the fact that he healed a man on the Sabbath 6 months ago. And so he's staying away from Jerusalem. He's in Galilee. He's trying to kind of keep a low profile. And then in verse 3, we see this. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world, for not even his brothers believed in him." Okay, so right here, John is just giving us a little background, some color commentary on the situation with Jesus. Not even his brothers believed in him. These were almost certainly the sons of Mary and Joseph, Jesus' half brothers by ordinary human descent, mentioned by name elsewhere in the Gospels: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. And their challenge carries a real edge to it. Basically, if you do these things, show yourself to the world. There's this implied skepticism that's embedded in this suggestion that perhaps Jesus performs his signs quietly in Galilee precisely because he isn't confident that they would hold up under the scrutiny of a larger, more public stage. I think it's worth sitting with for a moment because it's easy to romanticize the Holy Family in the Gospels. But Jesus' own brothers, who had 30 years of close, ordinary proximity to him, did not yet believe in who he was. Once again, familiarity, the very theme that John raised just a few verses ago, proves no guarantee of recognition of who he is. If anything, it can work in the opposite direction, breeding this kind of casual skepticism that distance and reputation alone might have prevented. But Jesus doesn't really take the bait, right? He says to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. I'm not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." Do you remember that phrase, aora, or the hour? The phrase that we saw back in the chapter with the wedding at Cana, right? Jesus' brothers are operating off of ordinary human timing. Any time is acceptable to them. Any ability for him to go and make himself known to the world is acceptable to them because they are operating within the deeper pattern of divine timing. But Jesus is consistently submitting himself to this divine timing. And he tells them plainly, "Hey, I'm not going to this feast." But in verse 10, he goes up anyway. But he doesn't do it publicly, he goes in private. He's not going on his brother's timetable, but rather on the Father's timetable, and going in a way that isn't validating their strategy for how visibility and public validation are supposed to work. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't deception on Jesus's part. Whatever the apparent tension might suggest on a surface reading, it's actually a refusal to let anyone else, however close the relationship, dictate the timing and manner of his self-revelation. That timing belongs to the Father alone. I think there's something that we could catch from that, right? No matter how close someone is to us, we a lot of times need to do the work of remembering that God is the one whose timing we're working off of. That puts us in verse 11, right? So let's pick up right here. Now the Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. So John starts to paint this vivid picture of a divided, anxious crowd buzzing with hushed arguments about Jesus, even before he publicly appeared. Some said he is a good man. Others said, no, he's leading people astray. So there's real tension going on here, and it's not neutral curiosity. This is genuinely a split in public opinion forming in real time. It's a very charged atmosphere in the midst of a major religious festival. And John adds a very telling detail. He says, "Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him." The religious authorities' opposition to Jesus, which we watched intensify in chapter 5, has apparently created a real climate of intimidation. People of all stripes and segments of life have very real opinions about Jesus, but very few of them are willing to talk about it openly or voice them publicly out of fear of the religious leaders. And so Jesus is hearing these things in quiet. But Jesus finally appears publicly midway through this 8-day festival and goes directly to the temple to teach. Right? So they're not talking openly about him. And then he's there in secret hearing these things. And all of a sudden, midway through the festival, he goes to the temple and he's teaching. And the immediate reaction from the listeners to his teaching is astonishment. And it's not primarily because of what he says, but at the evident depth of learning behind it, given the fact that he'd never studied under any recognized rabbinic leader. And for the culture, this is genuinely significant, right? The question they're asking, how do you know this much when you have never studied, when you're not educated, is a significant credentialing question. Because in first century Jewish religious culture, serious religious teaching authority normally required very formal training under an established rabbi who had a lineage of instruction that the listeners could trace and verify. Jesus doesn't have this, but his answer reframes the entire question of authority and credentialing. He says, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." Which should sound very familiar, right? This directly echoes that pattern established back at the beginning of chapter 6. In his extended defense, the Son does nothing of his own accord, doing only what he sees the Father doing. It's the same principle here applied specifically to his teaching authority. Jesus doesn't claim independent scholarly credentials. He claims something categorically different: direct communication and understanding from the Father himself. And then he says, if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Wow. This verse offers a genuinely important principle that I think is worth pausing on, because Jesus doesn't invite his listeners to first resolve every intellectual question about his authority before they're willing to act. He reverses that order. He says willingness to do God's will is the condition for recognizing whether his teaching is authentically from God. Obedience, or at least authentic openness to obedience, precedes clarity here, rather than clarity being the prerequisite for obedience. Now, I think it's important to know that this is not Jesus being anti-intellectualism. Jesus has just delivered a sophisticated theological argument after theological argument across this gospel. And so it's an insight about actual psychology and spiritual posture that's required to recognize truth. He's saying a heart that's already oriented towards self-interest or self-protection will find ways to dismiss even compelling evidence, while a heart willing to genuinely submit to God's will has the necessary posture to actually perceive it. Verse 18 adds a crucial diagnostic that Jesus has used before, back in chapter 5. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Self-seeking teachers, whether they're ancient or modern, can be identified by this exact pattern. The question is, and I think this is something that we should sit with and that we should put into our own context in modern day life. Whose glory is this teaching ultimately serving? So when you're breaking down Is this a false teacher? Is this a false prophet? Is this from God? You have to see whose glory is that teacher ultimately serving. Is it to the glory of God? Is it the Father's will? Or is it serving their own self interest? Let's keep going. Verse 19, right? Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? All right. Jesus directly and publicly is now naming the murder plot that has been simmering since chapter 5. This is genuinely bold, and to do this in public, right, at a major festival to a crowd of people that includes people actively involved in that plot. And what I think is interesting is the crowd's response. You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Suggests that many in the general festival crowd, as opposed to specific religious authorities orchestrating the plot, were genuinely maybe unaware of how serious the opposition to Jesus had already become. So Jesus then returns with very logical precision, talking about the healing controversy from the Sabbath that happened in chapter 5. I did one work and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. So let's break that down for a moment, right? Jewish law required circumcision on the 8th day after a boy's birth, even when that 8th day fell on a Sabbath. And so there had been a long established exception to Sabbath work restrictions that the religious authorities themselves fully accepted without controversy. So Jesus' argument is actually devastatingly simple. If circumcising a small part of a man's body is permitted on the Sabbath, in service of covenant faithfulness, how can healing a man's entire body on the Sabbath be treated as a punishable violation? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with righteous judgment. Jesus then concludes this with a call to look beneath the surface level of legal technicalities and search for the deeper purpose of the law itself that we were always meant to serve. There's a thread running underneath this entire passage, and it's worth naming directly. Every question raised here in this 24 verses about credentials, about timing, about the source of Jesus' authority is ultimately a question about origin. And so the question is, where does this actually come from? Jesus' brothers assume the answer should be a self evident and self promoting the way that human authority typically works, the way they've probably been used to within this culture of Jewish thought. The crowd assumes real teaching requires traceable, verifiable rabbinic lineage. And Jesus answers both of these assumptions in the same way. My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. This is that logic that Athanasius uses later on as he's teaching the church in the early years, working with a different layer of the text than we've traced before. If the Son's authority is authentically the Father's own authority, not borrowed or manufactured for the occasion, then the credentialing questions the crowd is asking are simply just the wrong questions, asked of the wrong category of person. You do not ask where the Son trained to produce light. The Son's teaching flows from what he is, not from the course of study he once completed. Let's go back to verse 17, right? Looking at verse 17, says this: if anyone is willing to do his will, he will know about the teaching, whether it is of God or I am speaking from myself. And these words, they deserve real attention through this framework of salvation or soteriology, the study of salvation that we keep referring back to and returning back to. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know. This, if anyone's will is God's will and is to do God's will, then he will know. This is not a formula for earning spiritual insight through good behavior. It's a description of the kind of heart posture that actually makes recognition of truth possible at all. And it's the same posture that the Philokalia calls purification, or the ongoing clearing away of self interest and self protection that otherwise cloud a person's ability to perceive spiritual reality clearly. Purification, right, as understood in the Philokalia and in this and in the teachings of the early patristic fathers, is the ongoing means by which grace already at work becomes perceptible. The fathers frequently pointed to Jesus' unstudied wisdom in this passage as evidence of exactly the claim that Athanasius would make, central to his entire argument on the incarnation, that the word who spoke through the prophets and gave the law to Moses was the same word now teaching in the temple, requiring no external instruction because he was himself the very source instructing every faithful teacher who came before him. Chrysostom, preaching on this passage centuries later, drew particular attention to verse 24, to judge not by appearances, but with the right judgment. This is a call to the kind of spiritual discernment that the Philokalia describes as diakrisis, or the capacity to distinguish rightly between what merely looks religious and what is actually true. And so this is a discernment that requires the same purified attentiveness that Jesus describes in verse 17. Again, purified attentiveness, this idea, we're going back to nepsis again. So all of these ideas that these teachings that then were taught throughout the earliest parts of the church, we're seeing woven through the scriptures and through the experiences that Jesus is having and that John is recording here. All right, so we just unpacked a ton of things. So I want to kind of recap and bring us home, right? Jesus' own brothers doubted him. A festival crowd argued in whispers about whether he was good or dangerous, while religious leaders plotted his death, and a wider crowd remained unaware of how far that plot had already progressed. And in the middle of all of it, Jesus stood in the temple and taught with an authority that left even his critics marveling, an authority that he was careful to trace back explicitly and repeatedly, not to himself, but to the Father who sent him. Right? He said, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know." That is the shape of true authority. Never self generated, never self promoting, but always pointing back to its actual source. And that is the shape of real spiritual perception as well. It's not primarily an intellectual achievement, but the fruit of a heart genuinely willing to submit before it fully understands. And this leads us to a few questions that I think are important to carry with you this week. First off, being, where have you, like Jesus' brothers, quietly demanded that God prove himself on your own timeline, according to your own strategy, for what visible validation should look like? And with that in mind, what would it mean to trust in his timing instead of continuously pushing for your own? Verse 17 says, willingness to do God's will precedes clarity about his truth. And so the question is there an area where you've been waiting for full intellectual clarity, full understanding before you're willing to obey? My mom used to say obedience is instantaneous. Like you have to be willing to obey instantaneously. And I think, and obey before you understand. I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. And lastly, where might you be judging by appearances rather than with right judgment or discernment? Jesus calls for evaluating something as spiritually legitimate or illegitimate based on surface level credentials rather than genuine fruit from the source. I think we need to look at our own voices who are speaking into our lives and how we're judging them, how we are being truly discerning of whether what they're saying is from God or whether it's self promoting, whether it's something to build up their own thought patterns, their own platform. And I think Jesus is saying there's a lot of things that you can pick up on the surface that somebody may seem like an intellectual, that they may seem like they know what they're talking about. But the fruit of what they're saying doesn't actually match what the intent of the Father is. And so that prayerful watchfulness, this attentiveness to seeking the Father's heart in such a way that you can now discern who is speaking the Father's truth is super important. A lot that we've unpacked in 24 verses today, and I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this time. And if the episode connected with you, I want to invite you to share it. Send it to someone who's been waiting for God to move on their own timeline rather than trusting in His. And if you think about it, leave a review on Spotify or YouTube because that genuinely helps other people find their way to this table so that they can also unpack and unlock the truths that are in this book. New episodes of Unlock the Word are available each and every week. And next week, we see episode 16. And we're not even leaving this scene. We're staying right here at the Feast of Tabernacles, where the tension in Jerusalem just keeps rising. Officers are actually sent to arrest Jesus and come back empty handed. Jesus makes one of the most dramatic invitations in this entire gospel, standing beside the water drawing ceremony, and the member of the Sanhedrin finally, quietly speaks up in his defense. And guess what? You're going to know who it is. You won't want to miss it, but until then, stay in the word, stay in the love.